Welcome back, folks. Continuing our tour of kind of the Procreate Basics crash course, whatever we end up calling this little playlist here. We're going to go through layer blending modes. We're going to start with the dark blending modes, and then I'll probably break it up into multiple videos for the lights and then the special effecty ones. So we're going to start with multiply, darken, color burn. You might have seen these options if you're playing with your layer options. They appear not only in Procreate, but in most, if not all, other kind of painting software like Photoshop and Illustrator, actually a bunch of other ones. These are fairly standard terms. It's pretty rare. I'm not going to say impossible, but it's pretty rare for one software to have modes that others don't, because these are all derived from different kind of computational methods of merging different images together in different ways to produce given results. So the way these videos are going to work is I'm going to cover kind of the official dictionary user manual definition of each mode, and then I'm going to show some examples of its like practical use, because even for me, and I've been doing this for 20 years, I've been using this stuff for a long time, and even for me, a lot of the like extremely technical definitions don't mean anything, because it's just like, well, that's the one I use for outlines. And yeah, so I'm going to try and make this functional over technical. So if you know some extremely technical esoteric details about some of these that I don't mention, it's probably on purpose, or I didn't think it was relevant to a like 101 level basic course, so don't add me. Okay, so we're going to start, first of all, before I even get into the blending modes, we need to very quickly cover hue, saturation, and value, which are factors that will go into your color selection. So you can see in Procreate's color picker tool, I've gone to the classic mode, but this is present in all the modes in one format or another. It's just a matter of kind of how you interface with it. So the classic one I think is easiest to see. See these three sliders here? That's hue, saturation, and value, also called brightness. These are going to be important because they're things that will come up in the definitions of these layer modes, right? So your hue is what color the thing is, the color that you're picking. So if I'm at maximum saturation there, the hue is whether it's red or blue or green or yellow or whatever. Saturation is our second slider, and that you can see is going to move the picker left to right, even no matter where I am. Zero saturation is always gray. There's no color in it whatsoever. 100% saturation is all color, no gray. It hasn't been kind of toned down at all. And then value is light to dark. So maximum saturation, maximum value. Maximum saturation, maximum value is going to be the greenest green that hue can be, or reddest red, or bluest blue, or whatever. Maximum brightness, minimum saturation is white. Minimum brightness is obviously black at minimum saturation. And actually, black is so overpowering that even at maximum saturation, it's still black. You can kind of see that this isn't a perfectly symmetrical sort of thing here. That's just how color kind of works. I'm not going to get into the physics of light and all other stuff because that doesn't really matter for what we're doing today. Anyways, so that's hue, saturation, saturated to gray, and then brightness. That will come up in these definitions. So when we talk about layer modes, you'll see, and again, this is in many different softwares, not just Procreate. Here I have an image in a bunch of different layers here. If I click on this N, this layer is in normal mode right now, which just means that whatever pixels are there are just there as pixels. It's not doing anything. It's not interacting with other layers. If I scroll up, we're going to start with multiply, and you'll notice that changed how that image looks. There's normal, there's multiply. I've also got a color wheel up here. We do the same tests. So this is obviously doing something. Let's get into the technical definitions of it. Multiply, and I'll pull it up on screen for us. This is from the Procreate official manual. I'm using their exact definitions because that's the software, but you can find almost the same thing on Wikipedia, in Photoshop's user manual, in a bunch of other places. They didn't invent this. This is what it is. Multiply. This mode multiplies the luminosity of the base layer by the blend color. The result is an overall darker and more intense effect. Multiply produces different levels of darkening depending on the luminosity of the blend layer. Multiply is perfect for darkening images and creating shadows. What the heck does that mean? Okay, well, in very basic terms, it makes white clear, it makes black opaque. It's more complicated when you're dealing with blending colors, but it will depend on the value, the last slider of the color, that particular pixel, how it will interact with the layers below it. And that's going to be true for most of these. So if I take this off that gray layer here, you can see that these pixels on this color wheel are blending differently with the things beneath it. On the value example, it's really simple because that's just a white to black gradient. So white is clear, gray is partially transparent, black is black. In practice, and again, I'll show you what this looks like in normal mode. See the white circles disappear, the black outlines stay, the white soft fades just fade as they get closer towards black when we go into multiply. In practical terms, this is really useful if you scan a drawing or are working with line work or whatever. Let's pull up our example here. Let's say I have a drawing. I want to keep the outlines and I want the white of my paper because I scanned it in to go away. Well, if I put it into multiply, the white goes away. And these are shading layers that aren't in there. So this is just, that is my outline layer. The black stayed behind. Turn that off. And I can color underneath it in a different layer and do whatever I want to it. See? That's where multiply is very, very useful. You might have also noticed multiply is good for shadows as well. If you take a multiply layer that's fully black right there, and actually I usually do shadows in grays or like dark desaturated colors, but that's a whole different story. We're not going to get into that too much right now. But if I take a black shadow, reduce the opacity, and put it into multiply, it makes a great shadow layer. Thank you, Mr. Smiley Face. That's going to be another one of our good examples there. So let's just take a tour of what multiply looks like. This is a value layer on top of all of these different images. So you can see the black stays. The white is completely transparent. This is pretty simple. Okay, so not too complicated there. Even if you don't retain the multiplied levels of depending on the luminosity of the blend layer and the color below, black is opaque, white is clear, easy enough. Let's move on to the darken mode. Definition. This mode does not blend pixels, but compares the base and the blend colors and keeps the darker of the two. So it's going to look at the pixel below the pixel on top, make a comparison to what that blended color would be versus the existing colors, and just pick the darker one. If the blend layer and the base color are the same, darken makes no change. So it's kind of a, I'm not going to say like dumbed down multiply, it's functioning a little bit different. So you can see here in, helps if I pull up the example. So I just put this layer into darken instead of multiply. You can see it right there. The gradient stops when the gradient kind of equalizes with that gray in the background there. It just stops doing anything once it hits that midpoint. So I'll compare, multiply, keeps going. It's making everything darker as it goes. Darken gets to the point where they're equal and quits. We can do that. It's, again, going to look a little bit weirder for color, but it's kind of doing the same thing. You can see it actually starts to separate this rainbow color based on where it equalizes that gray layer behind it. And actually what I can even do is, if I change the background color, you see how that's going to kind of iris, because white, it's not really ever hitting that equal point, so you get the whole image. If I darken, 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 it hits that same luminosity level or that in that blend color much sooner, so it just stops doing anything. So we're going to leave that on white because I've got a gray layer above this. All right, so let's take a look at that on different images there. That's fully opaque. Yes, good. Yeah, you can see based on this image, like certain colors hit it sooner based on what's behind it. On a gradient, it's just another version of what we just did with the background layer. On a white background, you get some color around the edges. The middle's pretty much left alone. A little bit different on a color image. You can do some cool tinting effects with this, sometimes depending on what your base image is. Yeah, I mean, that's about the size of that. We'll walk back through with just the value up. So you can see it's completely opaque until it isn't. You get you some really weird like burn effects sometimes that I don't always love, but in certain instances this is useful. And do you have to know exactly what every single layer is going to result in before you do it? No. Sometimes I put a layer on top of one another to do like an effect layer or shading layer or whatever, and then I just go, all right, I want it to do something in the darker category of blending options, and I just flip through them and see which result I like. That's fine. It's really not until you start combining a bunch of stacking layer effects that it helps to know exactly what each one is doing. All right, so that's our darken mode. Back to our definitions. Color burn. Ahem. Color burn is a mode designed to mimic the use of the burn tool used to darken images in traditional photography. So I actually developed film once upon a time back in like high school, showing my age a little bit. So dodge and burn, you might hear, because they're straight up tools in Photoshop, they're filters and options in different programs. Those are directly mimicking things you would do as you exposed photo paper in a dark room with a physical enlarger to affect the chemical reaction of light hitting that paper and exposing a piece of photography from film negatives, film strips. So that's what it's referring to there. Burn would be you mask out the rest of the area and then overexpose the area you want to be darker. So you would like block. That's why the image in Photoshop is like a hand doing this, because you would block an area, let the light shine through just a little bit. That's a fun image for the internet. Let the light shine through just a little bit, darken that spot, and then continue to expose the rest of the paper. That's burning. Literally burning. It increases the contrast between base and blend colors. This results in a higher mid-tone saturation and reduced highlights. Color burn usually produces a darker result than multiply. Well, let's test that. Boop. We're going to go back. We're going to go to color burn. Hey, yeah, it is a darker result than multiply, isn't it? I'm going to do the same up here. We're going to turn that one off for now. We're going to hide Mr. Smiley. All right, and let's run through our example images, shall we? So that's interesting. It's actually doing a little bit of color changing. And this is, again, similar to the effect you would get in an actual darkroom, because this isn't perfectly white snow in here. It's not a black and white image. There is some color there. So it's actually doing a little bit of blending with that black on top of it, burning into it. You can see it gets you some really dark, like redder tones. It really brings out the mid-tones, crushes down the highlights. That's what it said in the definition. That's what it's doing. Yeah, I mean, we're just going to see the same result over and over again. See darker mid-tones. That sky gets really blue, but the white goes away. The highlights come down. Now, I don't use this a whole ton directly in my artwork most of the time. But like I said, sometimes, you want to put a little magical sparkle on a weapon or something, or a laser gun or whatever you're painting, I don't know. Sometimes it's nice to just kind of flip through the options and see what these different modes do, and occasionally it'll be like, oh, that's actually kind of the effect I wanted on that. Great, that's all you really need it for. Next, linear burn. Linear burn decreases the brightness of the base color. Decreases the brightness of the base color based on the value of the blend color. This gives a result that is darker than multiply, but less saturated than color burn. It produces more contrast in darker colors than on other blended modes. Kind of just a different version of the same process. So let's put it to the test. Linear burn. Linear burn. We'll start with the value test. And it said just a little bit darker than other blend modes. And yeah, We can see that in action there. A little bit less of the, see, it's not bringing out the reds. Oh, gosh darn. I'm sorry, folks. All right, I'll back up. Gosh darn. That's what we say when we're on a friendly YouTube channel. Not what I say in the studio. Anyways, it's going to produce a darker result, and it's not going to increase the mid-tone contrast like crazy like the color burn mode did. So, and we can see that's basically what it's doing. I don't know why this layer is slightly transparent, but it is, and I'm just ignoring it. So you see here in particular, it's not bringing out those darker reds, but the black is still blending in, and in some areas where it's still only a little bit translucent, it is bringing out a little bit more of a burn, but it's not kind of pushing the colors to the extreme. You can see here there's a little bit of that color shifting happening, but not nearly as much as we saw in the color burn mode. That's a good example of it right there. It'll do it a little, depending on how much you put in there. And like this isn't bringing out the blue in this image quite as much. Bring out the color swatch. And kind of the same story. Again, using this with colors directly, I mean, this could be good for kind of colorizing something, giving it some nice shifted tint effects, but not usually going to be my go-to. I think there's better blend modes for that, but in some instances, useful. Okay, so there we are. That's linear burn. Last one we're going to cover in this video is going to be darker color. So let's pull up the definition. Darker color. Darker color functions somewhat like Darken. Instead of looking at each RGB channel individually, darker color takes a composite of all the RGB channels. So it's going to function really similar to how Darken did. It's using just a different mathematical process when it compares the pixels. It's taking more of an average than it is, you know, pixel by pixel and comparing each red, green, blue channel. Fair enough. Let's see it. Darker color. And darker color. Turn that off. And let's start from the bottom. See? Oop. Man, I almost got myself again on that one. Okay, you didn't miss anything that time. All right, so not really a whole lot happening on the gradient there. Interesting thing happening on this kind of image. It's because it's picking based on the averages, it's not going to give you a smooth gradation in places where those averages don't, aren't forming a smooth transition. So here, you get a little bit more of a smoother, and I'll turn that color cloud off. You get a little bit more of a cleaner transition because this is a much more ordered and regular image in the background. Not really a lot more to say on that one that wasn't already in the definition. It was pretty straightforward. So interesting, things here. There's some places where it just doesn't click, and then there's some places where it continues through based on what the average of those two channels is, or of those, all of the channels is, rather. Again, not a mode I'd use with a value like that too often. Well, here's a cool example. So up here, where this like hyper-saturated ring is hitting on the outside here, kind of useless. But you look in here and you see that, well, as that gets more towards a, because remember, this fades into white in the middle. It fades out of saturation. What it's actually doing is an interesting effect here where it's kind of just dyeing those little dots and leaving the rest of it. So I wouldn't paint solid full saturation colors here, but if you're using kind of a light tone, this could be a nice effect to put on something to give it little highlights or little pearlescent effects or whatever. Yeah, be hard to use on like real images like that. Here a couple interesting effects in different places. Wouldn't use it for that. But again, this is one of those things where, you have an afterburner and an image or something, and you're like, I want to give it a cool, weird color shifting effect. I'd run it through all the modes just to see. Yeah, you see it's kind of picking what parts of that gradient it likes and what parts are just not jiving with the math there. And same story there. All right, so that is a quick basic level crash course of the dark blending modes. Next lesson we're going to go into the lighter ones. We're going to do same format. We'll start with the definition, we'll look at practical applications, and just give examples. I don't think it's necessary to deeply understand the technical, and I'm sure that I've shown my ignorance in generalizing and paraphrasing some of the stuff here today. I don't think it's necessary to deeply understand what every single one of these is doing on like a computational mathematical level, but it's good to know that like, hey, if I kind of want this effect, I can put it through one of these modes and see what it does. And kind of just, again, we're building a toolbox here for artists. If you're a computer programmer who's working on like rendering shaders or something and you're frustrated because I'm skimming over a lot of the technical stuff, I'm sorry. You have my respect and awe, but that's also not what this class is for, so shh. All right, see you in the next one, guys.